I would like to welcome a gentleman, high official from the State Department. We're very grateful for him to come and address you. And of course, the reason he's here to address you is because that issue is important, not only to him, but to our country. And I want to just brief you on his background. It's very impressive and very long, and I don't think he would like me to go much about it because he's a very busy person. But he's really an impressive. He is Mr. Jake Wallace. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the State Department. He has been in the political field over 25 years. He is also the policy maker for several countries in the Middle East, including Egypt, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and I think Lebanon. And without any further, I would like you to welcome Mr. Wallace.
Thank you, Saeed, very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today with all of you, with the Syrian American Council. It's also a pleasure to be here and participate in what you're calling Freedom for Syria Day. For many years, I hoped that I could participate in such an event, and I'm really pleased that finally that day has come. Saeed was very generous in his remarks, and he explained to you my responsibilities in the State Department. What I can tell you is that I've been in this job now as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for 1 year. And in the year that I've had this job, I've had many meetings with Lebanese American groups. I've met with many Palestinian American groups. Of course, I've met with many Jewish American groups. And I've even met with Egyptian American groups. But this is the first meeting I've had with a Syrian American group. Well, I think it's about time that we've done this. And I'm glad to be here to do this today. It's time for me to be meeting with a Syrian American group. And I think it's also time for you to be organizing your community in this way. I'm very pleased that the Syrian Americans, that all of you have come together here in Washington to express your views to your government. And I'm pleased as well that your government, meaning me, is here today to listen to you and to understand your point of view. What's brought us together today, of course, are the recent events in Syria. What's happening in Syria is the same thing that has been happening throughout the Arab world this spring. Ordinary people are demanding the right to participate in decisions to shape their future. We take this right for granted here in the United States, but for too long, this right has been denied to Egyptians, Tunisians, Libyans, and of course, to Syrians. Unfortunately, the Syrian government has chosen to respond to the calls for freedom and democracy from its people with bullets and with beatings and with arrests. This is not what the great Syrian people deserve, a people with a long and distinguished history and culture. The Syrian people deserve the same freedom that we enjoy here, and the people across the Middle East are beginning to enjoy now as we speak. Here in the United States, our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, states a profound truth. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is a universal truth, and just as the rights outlined in this document are universal rights. In Syria, unfortunately, the government does not seem to understand this. But by denying its people their right to assembly and to free speech, The Syrian government is losing its legitimacy before the Syrian people. We have been clear about what the Syrian government must do. As President Obama outlined in his speech last Thursday, the Syrian government must stop shooting demonstrators and allow peaceful protests. It must release political prisoners and stop the unjust arrests. It must allow human rights monitors to have access to cities like Daraa, and it must start a serious dialogue with its people to advance a democratic transition. Otherwise, as President Obama warned, President Assad and his regime will continue to be challenged from within and isolated abroad. And when the Syrian government has ignored these calls, not just from the US, but across the international community, we have responded. President Obama has signed 2 executive orders imposing sanctions on individuals and entities committing human rights violations in Syria. These orders include President Bashar al-Assad, senior officials of the Syrian government, and the leaders of the internal security forces and the military. We have also sanctioned Iranian organizations, such as the Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, for the role that they have played in assisting the Syrian government's repression. In signing these executive orders, President Obama took a decisive step to increase pressure on the government of Syria to end its use of violence and to begin transitioning to a democratic system that ensures the universal rights of the Syrian people are respected. These new orders provide the United States with additional tools to hold the Assad regime responsible for its flagrant human rights abuses and continuing escalation of violence and intimidation against the people of Syria. We have closely coordinated our actions with our allies in the European Union, who imposed an arms embargo as well as their own targeted sanctions on May the 9th. On Monday of this week, the European Union further strengthened these restrictive measures by designating additional Syrian officials, including President Assad. The United States also led the call for a special session on Syria at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva on April 29th. That session passed a very strong resolution condemning the Syrian government and calling for an investigation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. As of today, the Syrian government has not allowed access to the High Commissioner's investigative team. They should do so immediately. And we have also successfully lobbied in recent weeks to prevent Syria from being elected itself to the UN Human Rights Council. We retain additional steps to hold the Syrian government and its leaders responsible if they do not change course now. The U.S. will call for further action at the Human Rights Council, and we will consider action in the UN Security Council to condemn the ongoing violence, torture, and arrests if they do not stop immediately. We reject the Syrian government's justification of its tactics as necessary to maintain stability. The Assad regime itself is the source of instability. Okay, I'll repeat that. The Assad regime itself is the source of instability. It is the regime that foments violence by meeting peaceful protests with deadly force and mass arrests. The Syrian government's violent repression and blatant disregard for the human rights of its own citizens only serves to stir up new violence. Even in the face of this horrific violence, the Syrian people continue to call for their legitimate demands to be met. Meeting the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people and ending the killing, torture, and arbitrary detentions of the protesters is the only way to achieve true stability. The Syrian government's actions are neither those of a responsible government nor a credible member of the international community. We will continue to hold to account senior Syrian officials and others responsible for the reprehensible human rights abuses against the Syrian people. We will also continue to work with our international partners to determine the most effective next steps if the Syrian government chooses not to abandon its current path. President Obama emphasized that the Syrian people have shown their courage in demanding a transition to democracy. As he said, President Assad now has a choice. He can lead that transition, or he can get out of the way. Our approach to Syria and its behavior is geared to a fundamental objective: the transformation of Syria from an agent of instability to a nation at peace with all of its neighbors, a nation that acts as a responsible member of the international community, and a nation that respects the rights of its people. I must admit that I am deeply skeptical that President Assad has the will or the means to do this. But I'm also just as deeply convinced that we must work together towards this goal with every tool that we have at our disposal. On behalf of Secretary Clinton, I want to thank you again for coming here today. Syrian Americans are one of the most successful immigrant communities in this country, a nation of immigrants, and we welcome the active role that you are now taking to help shape a democratic future for Syria. You are important stakeholders in Syria and its future, and it's important that you also contribute your voice to the discussion about what's going on in Syria and about the political transformation that will shape Syria's future. So let me thank you again for inviting me here today to join you and have a chance to speak with you. I think I have a few minutes. I can take a few questions if that would be good.